Hey everybody, it's Mr. Wagstaff. Cool stuff to talk about today. So, America is now in World War One. When America enters World War One, it is total war. It is complete and total commitment to World War One. The entire society is going to fundamentally change in order to accommodate this massive war. This is the war to end all wars. It was called the Great War. It wasn't called World War One at the time because that would be crazy. So the idea was this is the war. If you can win this war, there should not be any more wars. We look back on it and realize that's not even close to being true. But with that mentality, there is a massive focus on changing the United States society, like to the foundation, in order to win this war. And we're going to talk about all types of stuff that changed today in today's lesson. All right. Put myself up here in the corner. So now that we've declared war and we're good with Russia and all that, as soon as we do, there's a problem. Those U-boats, they make it very difficult to get across the Atlantic Ocean. So what we end up having to do is we go to this thing called the Convoy System. The Convoy System is where we take all of our cargo ships that are going to go across the ocean, and we kind of clump them together and have them go across as a group. And there's going to be, these are battleships. They're going to go with it and make sure that the U-boats don't mess with the cargo ships. A U-boat isn't dumb enough to try to mess with a battleship because a U-boat is much slower. It can't get away. The moment a battleship sees a U-boat, the U-boat's dead. So the convoy system is a way of us getting rid of the U-boats. We also put a whole bunch of like landmines that float in the harbor of Germany, so that the U-boats, because they don't have windshields, they can bump into them and blow up. So we put a whole bunch of mines, and so they're on a chain, and they float, and the chain's hooked to a weight. So the weight's on the bottom of the ocean, and there's a 30-foot chain, and then there's a floating bomb. So it sits 30 feet off the bottom of the floor, and then if a U-boat bumps into it, kablooey. Have you ever seen the movie Finding Nemo? The little floaty things, ooh, party balloons. If you haven't seen it, you won't get that joke. That is what those are. They're U-boat bomb blower-upper things. The problem is after World War One, we didn't keep real good track of where we put them at, so they're going to cause some problems. We also do it in World War II as well, but those mines, along with the American convoy system, very effective at avoiding the German U-boats. So we're able to effectively stop the U-boats with our concept of the convoy system, which is just this, going across in a herd protected by battleships. All right, so inside the United States, we're going to create a thing called the War Industries Board, headed by this dude, Bernard M. Baruch. All right, so I got a picture of these old dudes here. Look, old dudes. All right. This is Bernard Baruch. He's the head of the War Industries Board. So you need a lot of natural resources here in World War One. You have to have coal. You have to have stuff like that. So you only have a certain amount of that in a country. So you have to decide who gets it. The War Industries Board, man, they come in and they decide who gets the coal, who gets the oil, and things like that. The War Industries Board is extremely, extremely influential. So, give you an example. Something that oil is used for plastic. So if there are any plastic toys or something, the War Industries Board would say that company that makes plastic toys, you're not getting any oil during World War One because all of our natural resources have to go to stuff for the war effort. All right, to the extreme, where they would encourage people to keep their houses colder so that you didn't use as many natural resources like oil or coal. This is a guy keeping his house warm with a coal furnace, I guess. And it says, Uncle Sam needs that extra shovelful. Very famous poster here. Very famous poster. And years ago, one of my students ruined his poster for me because he goes, "Mr. Wagstaff, what's Uncle Sam doing to that poor boy?" And now it just looks like Uncle Sam's assaulting him, and it's really, really bad. So he's not. All right. Two other administrations that come out. So the War Industries Board basically decides who gets what, like what type of resources each company gets and how much. So if you're a company that's making guns, so say you're making hunting rifles before, and the government comes in and says, "Hey, I need you to make machine guns for World War One." All right. Now, you might think the company would be like, "No, I'm not, you can't tell me what to do." Well, the federal government will go be like, "How much money did you make last year?" And be like, Smith & Wesson, a gun company. And they'll be like, "I made, $1 million last year." And they're like, "Well, we will pay you $1.5 million if you'll make us machine guns." And every company's like, "Sure," because they make a profit off of it. Not only that, but they get like first dibs on all the natural resources and anything that they need for metal and iron and steel and anything like that, since they're making stuff for the war effort. So that's the War Industries Board. Two other administrations that come out here is the National War Labor Board and the Food Administration. So the National War Labor Board, all right, this is supposed to be a lot like their symbol here. So you got your workers, you got your politicians, I guess, and you got America agreeing with them that everybody's supposed to work together. The motto is work or fight for the National War Labor Board. The National War Labor Board, say you work for Smith & Wesson, and you were making rifles, and now you're making machine guns. Well, when the draft comes out, which is going to, called the Selective Service, which is going to grab troops and send them to go fight, and we'll talk about that in a later lesson. If you are working at an industry that is pivotal to the war effort, like making those machine guns, you are exempted from the draft. They're not going to draft you. However, if you go in and start causing problems at work, or trying to go on strike, or try to join a union, or do anything that can disrupt the making of the machine guns, the National War Labor Board is the one that can come out and be like, "You lose your draft exemption to the front lines with you." So the National War Labor Board is very influential on who gets to stay in America and make stuff and who has to go fight. Because again, is a full-on commitment to this war. America does not do this halfway. Once we get involved, it's go time. Another interesting is the Food Administration, headed by a guy named Herbert Hoover. This is going to be very successful, so much so that Herbert Hoover becomes popular from this. He is already a politician and will later become a president. And we won't talk so positively about him once he becomes president. But, so the Food Administration, created by Herbert Hoover, who's a politician at the time, was very effective. So America, because everybody in the world is at war, America is feeding the entire world. So remember, we had to come up with the Grange just to keep farmers from producing too much food, because that was a problem. Oh, you're making too much food. That's like not a typical problem that happens on Earth, is making too much food. But America, that was a problem. Now, there's no way you can make too much food, because we have to feed not only our own country, but all of our allies. So it is mass produce as much food as possible. So much so that we made so much food, but there's so many people that needed food that there wasn't enough food to go around. All right. So let me clarify what that means. First thing we did was feed our population. Any extra food, we feed everybody else's population, all our allies. All right. So the less food that we eat, the more food can be given to our allies and help us win the war. So there's this huge movement for growing a victory garden. Don't waste food, like only buy what you need. The big push for this to, if you don't need that food, don't eat it, because what it will eventually do is make its way to somebody else who will help us win this war. So the Food Administration, very effective in World War I at helping us help our allies. All right. So we got the War Industries Board, which basically, look, I can't even click on that. We got the War Industries Board, all right, which basically decides who gets natural resources. We got the National War Labor Board, decides who gets draft exemptions. We got the Food Administration that encourages people to eat as little food as possible, make your own like gardens at your house so that you can buy less food from the store so we can ship more food to other people. And then we have the Committee on Public Information. This one's really cool. There's the possibility for so many cool stories to come out of this, because this is basically like government-sanctioned yellow journalism. They're like, hey, everybody in America has to like the war. And the government's responsible, or given this guy here, all right, George Creel, he is responsible for making sure not only does everybody in America support the war, but that they think the war is going really well. I'll talk about that here in a second. So this is some of the stuff that comes out of the Committee on Public, Information. All right. So this is George Creel. This is the guy who's in charge of it. This is a very, very famous painting that you still see today. Prior to this, all right, this "I Want You for U.S. Army" by Uncle Sam. Prior to this, Uncle Sam was this like character, like he was almost a cartoon character, a mascot for America. Now, Uncle Sam is serious. Uncle Sam has gotten firm, he's gotten serious, and looks like Uncle Sam's ready to fight, just like you should be. That's the logic here. So Uncle Sam goes from like a cartoon character to like, Uncle Sam got serious, I need to get serious too, and what do I need to do for this war effort? Also on the Committee of the Public Information is this right here, is Destroy This Mad Brute. This is supposed to be Germany. Well, you can tell by the little hat. So they're like, all right, how do we make people look like bad guys? Like, we dehumanize them. They just go right back into like the imperialist playbook and try to dehumanize the Germans. And you're like, but aren't the Germans white? Like, aren't they, doesn't America have a massive population of Germans? Like, yeah. All that's true. It's racism. It doesn't follow logic. This actually doesn't stick. It's interesting to see how in World War I and World War II, we treat the Germans with a lot more respect than we treat other civilizations that are not white. And we'll talk more about that. But yeah, it's the trying to dehumanize the enemy. This is supposed to be carrying off Lady Liberty. If you're like looking at your screen, like, is she naked? She is not anatomically correct. So yeah, I looked at it, I was like, what in the world? How did in the 19 teens did the United States government put out a picture of a naked lady? But she's not actually naked. It's not, it's like a naked action figure. But that's supposed to be Lady Liberty, like the Statue of Liberty, that the evil Germans are stealing our liberties. He also, George Creel, is responsible for using the Boy Scouts. The Boy Scouts of America come out at the time. This is important to understand. When we say we committed to this war, we weren't committing to it right now. We literally started training the next generation of soldiers. We create the Boy Scouts as a paramilitary organization to teach kids, all these early on responsibility, loyalty, oath, courage, bravery, all these things in Boy Scouts, camping outside, hiking, living off the land, stuff that makes for really good soldiers. Boy Scouts was designed, if this war lasts 50 years, we need to already have our next generation of men starting to be prepared for it. And that's what the Boy Scouts came out. So the propaganda, this idea that the Germans are bad and we have to keep doing this, was really perpetuated by the Boy Scouts. Let me explain to you real early on why it is so important for everybody to like the war. All right? It has to do with this thing called war bonds right here. Very, very, very important right here. World War I and World War II both talk about war bonds. Now, while George Creel, with the Committee on Public Information, propaganda, He is allowed to lie as much as he wants to convince everybody the war is going really well. He really doesn't have to lie in World War I. That's why there could be all these great stories that come out of it, of how he manipulated the truth. He doesn't really have to, because honestly, and we'll talk about this more in the next lesson, America's going to drop a hammer on everybody. Like, it goes well pretty much from the time we get there. It's win after win after win after win for America. And we'll talk about how that happened and why that happened in a later lesson. But how did we pay for the war? Well, here's how America paid for the war. And it's these things called war bonds. So what happens is, if you want to make some money, what you're going to do is you'll go to the bank during World War I and be like, I want to buy a war bond. And you give them $10 and they'll give you a war bond, $10 war bond. Now, you take that war bond home and you sit down at home and you just wait. Well, when the war is over and America wins, that's the key, war is over and America wins, you take that war bond back to the bank, they'll give you $20 for it. They'll double your price. So basically what you're doing is investing in America winning. So war bonds, all right, if you can buy war bonds and America wins, you make a profit. This is how America paid for World War I, is getting people to buy war bonds. They'll worry about paying everybody back later, but right now we want your $10 for that $10 war bond. Now, you have to have people buy war bonds. It's absolutely pivotal that people buy war bonds, or you can't fight this war, because we won't have any money. So that's why George Creel is so important. He had to convince everybody that the war is going really well. Because when will everybody buy war bonds? If they think the war is going to end tomorrow and that America's going to win, you go buy your war bonds today, so you just make a bunch of money tomorrow. So George Creel's job is to constantly convince people that the war is getting ready to be over and we're about to win, and you have to go buy your war bonds right now. All right? He didn't have to try real hard, because America's gonna destroy some people pretty quickly when we get there. Again, we'll talk about why that is in the next lesson. However, one of the worst things that could happen is if the American people turn against the war and then they refuse to buy war bonds. So the United States government passes a law called the Espionage and Sedition Acts. All right. So this is extremely controversial. So the Espionage and Sedition Acts in World War I says that you cannot talk trash about the government. It's the Sedition Acts. You cannot talk trash about the government because we need people to buy war bonds. And if you talk trash about the war and you talk trash about the government, people won't buy war bonds. So you can't do that. Not only that, they were terrified. The United States government was terrified that because we have so many German Americans here, there's going to be German spies. So there's these rules where you can't talk about the war. You can't write a letter to your friend about the war. Nobody talks about the war. Don't talk about it. Love it and appreciate it. Read George Creel's newspapers. Get your propaganda. Do not talk about it. If you know so-and-so that's on a ship somewhere, don't you dare talk about it, because you don't know where the spies are around you. You talk about paranoid is pivotal. These are posters at the time. Says, no war talk, obey the law, and keep your mouth shut. The famous one, loose lips might sink ships. I pledge allegiance and silence about the war. They're like, don't talk about it. If you know anything, like if you know, because so many people got drafted and are over there fighting it, and you might be getting information, don't talk about it with anybody, because it could fall in enemy hands and it could put them in danger. That's what the Espionage Acts. The Sedition Acts, let's go back to that, where you can't talk trash about the government. Charles Schneck, that's how you pronounce it, Charles Schneck, he was against the war. He wrote all these pamphlets and passed them out saying the war is wrong, the draft is wrong. They can't force you to go fight in the military. That goes against the 13th Amendment, which is anti-slavery. He's like, they can't force you to go do that. So he talks trash about the government, all right, and this violates the Sedition Acts. He is arrested. He goes, he takes his case all the way to the Supreme Court, in the Supreme Court case, Schneck versus the United States, and he says, they took away my First Amendment rights. They can't do that. The Supreme Court ruled, well, since it's for national security, meaning that if people don't like the war, they won't buy war bonds. All right. Since it's for national security, the government does have the right to take away your rights. And Schneck versus the United States is the one that's going to put limits on freedom of speech for the first time. The other arguments that they make here, and they're like, it's like, yeah, you have freedom of speech, but you can't go into a movie theater, and movie theaters had just gotten popular then, and everything's made out of wood. You can't go into a crowded movie theater and scream fire if there's not a fire. You can't do that because you can create like a stampede of people, and people get mowed down and trampled, and people can get really hurt. But you can't hide behind, well, I can say whatever I want because it's freedom of speech. Like, there's limits to freedom of speech. And that's what they say at this Supreme Court ruling, which is still in effect today, that the United States government, when it is not convenient for them, can limit your freedom of speech. When they feel like it's in the best interest of everybody, they can limit your constitutional rights. And the United States government and the Supreme Court have upheld that it is the right of the United States government to make that distinction. Even crazier of all that, I put my, because you don't need to know, she has nothing to do with this picture. Eugene Debs, he's the leader of the industrial workers of the world. He runs for president all the time. All right. In 1916, he runs for president against Woodrow Wilson. America is not in the war. America does not get involved into the war until 1917. In 1916, Eugene Debs says the war is a mistake and we should never get involved. Talks a bunch of trash about the war. Woodrow Wilson in 1916 is also running on a campaign that we're not going to get involved in this war. Woodrow Wilson wins. And when he wins in 1917, we get involved in the war. Well, you can't have Eugene Debs, who's in charge of the largest union in the United States, the industrial workers of the world, who's against the war. That could be really bad if he tells everybody to go on strike, and then you shut down our entire production and we can't make stuff for the war and we can't win. So they go back after the Espionage and Sedition Acts are passed and arrest him for things that were said in 1916. The Espionage and Sedition Acts did not exist when he said all these negative things about the war. They made the law later, then went and arrested him for things he said before the laws existed and put him in prison through the duration of World War I, mainly to keep him from making his union go on strike. You're like, what? What country do we live in? There's enough. Luckily, when there's crazy stories like this, we can talk about them in the history of the United States in one survey class, that they are not common. But yeah, this stuff happens. It's crazy. So Eugene Debs is arrested for violating the Espionage and Sedition Acts, even though what he did to violate the Espionage and Sedition Acts didn't happen until after the Espionage and Sedition Acts were created. All right. Another really big thing happens here. It's called the Great Migration. Now, there's the Great Migration, and then there's the Second Great Migration, which is going to happen in World War II. The Great Migration means movement of, in this case, people. This is black people are going to leave the South, moving to cities in the North during World War I. There's a handful of reasons of why that is happening. Number one, is a lot of racial discrimination in the South. If you have any options to leave the South during this time period, a lot of people wanted it, but there just weren't options. The vast majority of black people in the South were cotton farmers. Well, right when World War I is starting, all right, there's already racial discrimination. There's these daggone bugs. I'll show you a picture of it here. This is a bug. It's called a boll weevil. Boll weevils destroy cotton crops. Well, these sharecroppers in the South were desperately just trying to keep ends together. There's a huge infestation at the start of World War I with these bugs that flew into the southern part of the United States and destroyed all these cotton fields in the South. So, African Americans in the South, they already, massive discrimination in the South. Now their entire crops are dead, that there's no way to make money. And then all these men got drafted and sent out to war. There's all of these empty factories in the North. So this is in 1910, all right? This is before the Civil War. This is the population of African Americans in the United States. You can tell that the vast majority of African Americans live in the South, where the cotton belt here. So the next map I'm getting ready to show you is 10 years later. So when 1917, when World War I starts for America, there ends up being all of these jobs up here in the North where African Americans will flock to. So I'm going to switch it to the map here. This is 1920 now. If you notice, I'm going to go back. It's 1920. I'm going to go back to 1910 to show you something. Notice down here in like South Carolina, these huge populations of African Americans here in South Carolina for cotton. If I go to the 1920 map here, look how, I mean, it's vacant in a lot of these places. And you get these big cities up here that show up, and a lot of African Americans are moving to the cities because there's jobs there. There's factory jobs there in World War I. So many people have been drafted to go off to work. You need people in factories. So the Great Migration is this massive move of African Americans from the rural South to cities in the North. So African Americans aren't leaving the cities in the South because there are no cities in the South. They're leaving the rural countryside in the South, and they're moving to the cities in the North. So you're going to see the percentage of cities, the percentage of black people in cities is going to skyrocket starting in World War I, and then the change stops for a while. In World War II, the same thing happens for almost the exact same reasons, minus the boll weevil. All right, women during the war. We had mentioned this when we talk about the Progressive Era with women in the 19th Amendment. All the men left. Somebody's got to step up and do all these factory jobs. Women are going to fill that role very, very effectively. So women are going to step up, fill that role left by men. The 19th Amendment, which gives women the right to vote, is in large part after the war is over, everybody's like, it's not like, hey, women did this here, let's reward them. It was more of an eye-opening experience. Like, yeah, why have we been treating women as second-class citizens? They can clearly do the same as men can. So women during World War I step up and filled a lot of these factory jobs. So the 19th Amendment is passed in 1919. This is a picture of women working on an airplane wing. And we'll talk more about airplanes here shortly. So new roles. Not only were women in working in factories, women also, for the first time, were allowed to join the Marines, which I think is 13,000 women served in the military. Now, they were non-combat positions, but this is the first group of lady Marines that became Marines in World War I. And the coolest name, they're called the Lady Hellcats. And these are the first female Marines. So, African Americans are segregated in the United States Armed Forces. This is a Woodrow Wilson directive. So while Woodrow Wilson gets a lot of credit, we're going to talk a lot about him because he's very influential. Woodrow Wilson's pretty racist. When you look back on it historically, he's the one that's going to segregate stuff. Black people are not allowed into active combat. All right. There's all these racist reasons, and they're just absolutely ridiculous. Like, there's no basis for the racial reasons for why black people can't serve in combat. And you're like, well, Mr. Wagstaff, give me an example. Okay. So the military believes, and I laugh because it's horrible, because this is an official policy. The reason black people in the United States can't serve in combat, are you ready for this? This was official. Black people can't see at night. That was, if you're like, what? Yes. You're like, wait, you mean because they're black, they're harder to see at night? No. I'm saying the belief was black people have really bad night vision. What? And you're like, let me clarify. They don't. Like, there's no difference in your vision regardless of race. But it was just a made up thing to keep black people out of combat. Like, they would make up stuff just for racial reasons, and race doesn't follow logic. So this is a picture. I want to tell you the story. This is really cool. So France was super low on troops, and they're like, oh my gosh, we need more troops. and they asked, can they rent troops from the United States? And the United States is like, yeah, we're not giving you any troops. General Pershing that we're going to talk about, he's not going to give away troops. And they're like, well, you have a whole bunch of black soldiers that aren't being used for combat. Can we rent them? And like France is asking to rent black soldiers, and we're like, you know they can't see at night, right? And France is like, what? Yes, whatever. We'll take your troops that can't see at night. And so we rent out an all-black unit called the 369th to France, who serve in combat and absolutely wreck shop. They're like a special forces unit. They win every possible award you can win from France, and absolutely prove that black people are extremely effective in combat, just like anybody else. But we completely ignore the data, and after World War I is over, black soldiers like the 369th here, even though they did fantastic in World War I when fighting for France, they're relegated to second-class citizens once again, especially in the military. All right, Eddie Rickenbacher. Now, we're going to talk about airplanes tomorrow, but I do want to point out real quick, Eddie Rickenbacher was the ace. Means he was the greatest fighter pilot in World War I. And we're going to talk about planes and stuff tomorrow, but he is worth mentioning here when we're going to talk about another American hero, that Eddie Rickenbacher was the best fighter pilot for all of the Allies. He shot down 20 people and ended up living after the war. It's crazy. But Eddie Rickenbacher, as we'll talk more about fighter jets tomorrow, or fighter pilots tomorrow, he was the elite one in World War I, and this is a colorized picture of him. That's Eddie Rickenbacher. All right. Alvin York. Now, I'm going to tell you this story. All right. It's a pretty interesting one to answer here. This is one of my favorite stories of all of American history. Here's Alvin York. He's a conscientious objector. He's super, oh no, I don't want to go die. All right, let me back up. A conscientious objector is a guy or a person who is morally against fighting in combat. Alvin York grew up in Tennessee, very poor. He gets drafted in World War I, but Alvin York, he's super religious. So he shows up where he's drafted. He's like, oh no, I can't. I don't think I could shoot nobody that goes against my religion. Jesus wouldn't want me to do that. So the guy at the recruiting station is like, what? He's like, I'm a conscientious objector. Now, people probably tried to pull this relatively often to get out of the draft. So they'd spend all day talking with him and verifying that he is morally against it. And finally, at the end of the day, the guy's like, fine, you're exempt from the draft. You go back home, you're a conscientious objector. Ruins this guy's day. And he's like, I'll go get the other people. So Alvin York goes home. He's like, oh no, I could do something other than, shooting people. I feel like I've let my country down. All right, this is not how Alvin York talks, but this is how I'm going to make him talk. So Alvin York goes back the next day and he's like, hey, I can do something like be a mechanic or something, and I can join the army. The same guy's there, and he's like, you got to be kidding me. You wasted my whole day yesterday because you had to get out of the draft, and now you're going to volunteer? Fine. So he slides a piece of paper at Alvin York, who can't read, and Alvin York signs it. What Alvin York signs up for is the infantry. Now, apparently Alvin York's not real smart, because when he's sending the basic training, they're teaching him how to use guns and everything, and he's like, I don't know why they need me to know how to use a gun when I'm clearly not going to be in combat. All right? So Alvin York gets shipped off to be on the front lines, and he's oblivious to this, over in Europe. And he gets there, and America doesn't do a lot of time in the trenches, but he's in the trenches here. So Alvin York gets sent over there, stuff is blowing up all over him. He's like, oh no, what am I going to do? And then the commanding officer comes out and starts blowing his whistle, which means you got to charge. So Alvin York and his boys, all right, who I imagine they probably make fun of Alvin York because he's like, I'm not going to shoot anybody. You're here with a gun, whatever. And he starts charging across no man's land. They hop up, my feet are still here, hooray. And they are charging across no man's land just as fast as they can. And Alvin York's apparently Forrest Gump, and he's just 10 times faster than everybody else. He's like, ha, 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 ha. And as he gets across no man's land, hurdling barbed wire, He's like waiting to get shot, but he doesn't, and he jumps down in the enemy trench. He's like, "Ha! We made it! We made it, guys!" Well, the other guys chickened out halfway across and ran back into the American trench. He is now in the German trench by himself, but just where he landed at, there's nobody there. So he's like, "Oh no, this is not good." So Alvin York decides to just like start walking through the trenches. He's like, "I want to explain to them what has happened. Let them go back to my side." So as he walks around a turn, there's a whole bunch of Germans there. There's like 2 Germans there, and they're like, let's get them. And they turn around, and he pulls his gun up, and he's like, "Pow, pow," and shoots both of them. He's like, "Oh, that's not hard." Now he's only got like 1 bullet left. So he drops his gun and picks up their guns and just starts marching through the trenches, just pow, 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 pow. Just taking out the Germans in the zigzag line as he walks through the trenches. There is a situation, this is a true story. There's a situation here where he's trying to take a machine gun nest because he's just decided to be the Terminator. And he runs out of ammunition. There are 6 Germans that try to attack him with bayonets, which is the knives on the end of their rifles. He gets a handgun with 6 bullets in it from a dead body and shoots all 6 of them. All right. And then he rounds a turn, and there's a whole bunch of Germans, like 132 of them, looking at him. And he's like, "Oh no." Well, they've been hearing all the commotion. They think that he is the beginning of all the American troops invading the trenches, and they all surrender to him. And he's like, because they think there's a whole bunch of Americans behind him. He's like, "Oh, okay." So in the very limited amount of German that he was taught in basic training, he tells them all to turn around with their backs to him, get on their knees, and every German is given a pair of handcuffs in case they take a prisoner. He goes to every single German, takes their handcuffs, puts them on them. Handcuffs, puts them on them. So all of a sudden, the other trench, if you're on the American side, the other trench has gotten real quiet. And they're like, "What has happened?" Everybody just assumes Alvin York is dead, because why wouldn't he be? Alvin York hops up on the other side and says, "Got him!" And Alvin York, the conscientious objector, ends up being the American hero in World War I, once killing 25 Germans by himself and capturing 132 others. All right, that's as far as we're going to get today. Hope you enjoyed that.